Hello, class. In this slide here, I'm responding to an overall question for which there are several related questions on Moodle regarding the issue of, do immigrants cause crime? Because if they do, then this has a major influence on our policies and how we should think about this issue. And what I'd like to discuss in this slide is some research by the Cato Institute that has been looking at this issue in great detail for a while now. And what Cato finds, and if you follow this link, you can go right to the web page and read it in its entirety. I will also post this as a separate link on Moodle. And what they find is that immigrants to the U.S. generally have lower incarceration rates compared to native-born Americans. And it should be noted, however, that crime rates tend to actually increase among second-generation immigrants. This is a finding that was reported by Pew Research, also published in the journal Justice Quarterly. If you can see on the graph on the right, with the first generation age crime curve is well below native-born Americans. But then you have second generation, so the children of the first generation immigrants, their children have crime rates that are now similar to native-born. So as immigrants become more acculturated to U.S. culture, they become more likely to commit crime, which is an interesting story all in of itself that we could talk about for some length. But for the first generation immigrant, they are, if anything, far less criminally involved on average than native-born or indigenous Americans. And it's also a finding by Cato, and this is not just their researchers, it's an overview of all the major research on the topic, that neighborhoods with relatively large proportions of immigrants have lower crime rates than neighborhoods with majority native-born. And the reason why people may think otherwise, there is a possibility that it is an extension of what sociologists have called the racial threat hypothesis, or the perception that your neighborhood is being invaded by outsiders. And so this research on the racial threat goes back several decades now. It was originally applied to blacks moving into majority white communities and the perception that blacks are bringing crime, but it easily could be applied to immigrants largely from Latin American countries, namely Mexico, as you can imagine. And so that may be part of what is driving the perception. But there is a caveat to this as well, that according to Cato and also the Pew Research Center, that this is not a view that's actually broadly endorsed by most Americans. Most Americans, their perceptions actually do match reality. That when asked, most Americans believe correctly that undocumented immigrants don't commit more crime than native-born. You can see on the chart in the bottom right-hand corner. So it is only among a certain segment of Americans that have this, what you might call a xenophobic reaction to learning that we have immigrants coming. Some are illegal. Well, many of them are legal, more legal than illegal, but they perceive this as being a threat. And so they are a vocal crowd and they do make headlines. And so this is what is feeding into the narrative that people are fearful of immigrants because of their criminal behavior. This is not the majority of Americans. They don't feel that way. As Cato points out, though, This research on comparing native-born Americans to immigrants almost always combines legal with illegal immigrants. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about this. Often there's nothing you can do about this because in 49 states, you have governments and agencies simply not collecting data on immigrant status among those people in jails and prisons. So in many instances, we just don't know. And this is something conservatives often bring up, is that you can't really make apples to apples comparisons between native-born and immigrants if you're lumping illegal immigrants together with legal immigrants, because illegal immigrants are by definition committing crime by being here illegally. Okay, so the question is then, if we can separate out legal immigrants from illegal immigrants and then compare them to native-born, well, what do we get? Here, Texas is the exception. In the state of Texas, perhaps no surprise, because it's a border state with Mexico, they do collect information on the immigrant status of people in their jails and prisons. But again, what they find is that conviction rates for illegal immigrants are about half that of native-born Americans. And legal immigrants have the lowest conviction rates of all. So legal immigrants, people who have the wherewithal to get here legally, are the most conventional, most conforming, most law-abiding. And then you have illegal immigrants, and then the group that's least likely to be law-abiding are native-born. Okay, so again, here we have a situation where by many different estimates and different research, we find that immigrants, whether legal or illegal, tend to, on average, have lower participation in crime. I just want to leave you with this, though, and this is something that struck me as being just missing from the research. This research, all of this stuff comparing native-born to legal and illegal immigrants, does not disaggregate by race. We cannot forget what we learned in this class early on when we start talking about immigration, that the U.S. is a racially diverse country, and specifically the crime rates between blacks and whites are very different. That you have much higher violent crime rates and victimization rates among blacks compared to whites. And so really, to get to the bottom of this issue of just finding out how much more or less criminal immigrants are compared to native-born, we would have to disaggregate by race, because this comparing immigrants to the average native-born American obscures the fact that there are big differences in crime rates according to one's racial group. So you have to think about it like this. Well, what would happen if we compare native-born blacks to legal and illegal immigrants versus comparing native-born whites to immigrant populations? My hunch is what you would find is that illegal and legal immigrants have, of course, lower crime rates than native-born blacks, but I don't know if you would find also the case that if you would look at illegal immigrants and compare them to native-born whites, if you would find lower crime rates. You might find higher. And if you look at, and I'll put this link on Moodle that goes to another research institute that has looked at illegal immigrants in federal prisons, that they are overrepresented there. And now these are federal prisons, and so we know there's a problem in making broad sweeping assumptions about criminality just looking at federal prisons, because most people don't end up in federal prisons. But there is some evidence that illegal immigrants have higher crime rates if you look at the federal prison population. Okay, and so this is some additional information to digest when it comes to assessing this question that is deeply important when we are trying to get our border situation correct. And so we want to keep this in mind. How much of a threat do immigrants pose? Well, overall, it doesn't look like too much, but we have to consider who we're comparing. Are we comparing legal to native born or illegal to native born? And furthermore, we cannot forget the fact that not everybody in the United States has an equal risk of being a victim or participating in criminal behavior. There are big racial differences in the United States when it comes to criminal behavior, and we would have to drill further down the data and disaggregate by race to get a more accurate, nuanced picture of the situation if we want to have a serious conversation about this, that is. I think oftentimes politics will trump evidence here, and people will want to stick to their political talking points rather than have a serious conversation, which is going to have to be data driven. It's going to have to be empirical. Otherwise, we're just generating heat, not much light. Okay, folks, so I hope this was helpful. I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.